All right, welcome to the Rehumanization Station. I'm your collaborator, Christopher Jones, aka Dr. X, and this podcast is an extension to my Flippin' and Vibin' brand, where vibers seek to transform narratives in society, education, and sport. Today is our collaborative praxis series where we have a wonderful viber named Shabana Marshall with us today. Shabana, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for inviting me, Christopher.
Oh, that's good. I'm glad.
Very excited.
Thank you for taking out your time out to come here today. Shabana Marshall is a senior lecturer at St. Mary's University and a PhD researcher at Durham University's Department of Sociology. Her research, titled Towards Decolonizing the Curriculum, Identifying the Barriers and Opportunities Present in Teaching Colonial History and Heritage Through a Local History Lens. Her research will explore how primary schools in white majority areas of England approach teaching of local history linked to Britain's colonial era, and the factors that influence and inform their approach. Shabana is also adopting a critical whiteness methodology. She will center her study on the northeast majority white town in England called Middlesbrough. And what people may not know is that Middlesbrough is the birthplace of Captain James Cook. And no, y'all, this captain has no affiliation to Captain James Hook from Peter Pan. I actually Googled that. I Googled that. I was like, this has to be similar, right? But there's no affiliation. There's no affiliation. But I definitely had to Google that because I'm an 80s baby, but 90s raised me. Okay. So I had to really Google that. But back to Captain James Cook, excuse me, is a renowned 18th century explorer, navigator, and colonizer with a connection celebrated through the town's museums, monuments, and local school curriculums, therefore providing a useful case study for exploring the potential barriers and opportunities that may exist within and beyond a school to quickly engaging with Britain's imperial past. Wow, that's going to be, it seems very exciting. That's something that we're definitely going to get into today, but we will get into more of Shabana's research around Britishness and whiteness in schools later in the show. But what we'll focus on now in this interval of the show is Shabana and I will just vibe and allow our viber audience to get an idea of your background, right? Shabana's background and personal interests. So, Shabana, what's your story? Tell us a bit about yourself, your birthplace, your family and friends.
So I was born in a place called Newcastle in the northeast of England, and my parents arrived in Britain Dad arrived in the late 50s, Mum arrived in the 60s. At that time there wasn't a South Asian community, so to speak. So they were what I would argue like amongst the founding members. So I grew up in the west end of Newcastle in the 70s and the 80s. Race and racism is kind of central to my experience of growing up, and I think has had a huge influence then in my interests moving through my life. And my understanding of race and racism has just changed over time, and how I kind of process experiences, or even how I define what race and racism is. You know, when I was younger, you would maybe face verbal abuse in the street, attacks on our property, attacks on our person. So we learned from a very young age that we weren't welcome, I guess. But then when I went to university, I was quite shocked to encounter racism there in the 80s and 90s.
Which university did you go to?
I went to Sunderland. It was a polytechnic at the time, which was like what the post-92 universities then sort of become universities later. So I qualified from Sunderland Uni, but it was a polytechnic. And then Birmingham Uni for an MA. And then did a PGC at London's Institute of Education.
Okay.
But yeah, I grew up in a working class environment. I associated racism with people on the street, on the estates near that bordered onto where we lived. So to encounter it from educated middle class people was just not something I was ready for.
Okay.
So it kind of makes you cautious moving through life, and then started teaching in a secondary school in the East End of London, and encountering racism there in a different form again from students, from staff.
Was there like a particular difference between how students and staff treated you? Were there differences within that?
Yeah, so I was there was a staff of around, in the first school, around 60 staff members, and there were 4 or 5 of us who were teachers of colour, and we kind of hung out together as well. And I never thought about it consciously. I was only reflecting back, thinking, oh my gosh, like the people I was closest to were all teachers of colour. But that was right-wing extremist. Politicians dominated that area, and local people. It was a white majority area. So you might have people leafleting for the British National Party at the gates of the school. In the school, students bringing that in. Huge kickback if we were teaching a unit that was called Black Peoples of America, or in RE if we taught religious education, if we taught Islam, parents writing and complaining. So you were just hyper aware of not being white. And so from the West End of Newcastle to very white spaces of Birmingham Uni particularly, and then teaching in the East End of London, it just kept finding myself in these very white spaces where you just felt really hyper aware of being a person of colour. But then I'm also Muslim. My family are Muslim, and especially when 9/11 happened, then it was a whole other level of racism and prejudice layered onto being.
I'm from the U.S. So how was it navigating that here? Because I don't really know much about the post 9/11 here.
Yeah, so my family are Pakistani Muslim. We're Punjabi from parents were on the India side of the Punjab, moved over to Pakistan during the partition, forcibly, but so Islam was a very strong thread in my youth. But growing up, you weren't necessarily, I don't remember being particularly targeted for being Muslim, but it was, you were black, you were called the N-word, you were called the P-word, but with 9/11, Islam you became an enemy because you were perceived as Muslim. It made me initially more cautious about sharing whether I was Muslim with people, because you just felt people change in their perception of you. It made me, and still does, make me very worried for someone like my mum, who is visibly Muslim. I'm really anglicised. My husband's white English. And that being anglicised is, on some level, quite a conscious sort of survival thing,
right,
to fit in. But it's also, as I've grown older, I feel I'm able to sort of carry the various identities together more comfortably, but it's been quite a journey. But 9/11, we were in Australia when 9/11 happened. We were travelling, my husband and I, and that just suddenly the anti-Islamic language and comments, and people not necessarily realising I was Muslim, so they'd sort of say things and then say, well, actually I'm from a Muslim family, and just that association with terrorism, being regarded with suspicion, it's seeming to be okay to be anti-Muslim.
Okay.
So, and then that carried into when we came back from travelling and start working, I started teaching in the northeast of England. In schools, the new sort of term of abuse that kids would use would be towards other children who were Muslim, Osama became a term of abuse.
That's actually okay.
Just to sort of trigger, so that the fight would break out because the child on the receiving end understood exactly what was being said. And
very similar. It's very similar to my upbringing because I was, when 9/11, I was in the 6th grade. So when I grew up a little bit more, you started to hear more of that rhetoric, Osama, like the kids like trying to tease people in that type of way. But yeah, it's interesting how things are very comparable when it comes to England and the U.S., right? And I remember you talked about terrorists, and we'll get into that later about British values and what that looks like compared to how we view people who are from a Muslim background, right? But on the side, okay, now thank you for like sharing that with us, like a bit about your background. But now we obviously know like race and racism can be can be problematic and could be difficult to navigate through. But what activities bring you peace, love, and happiness?
yeah, that's a challenging one because in some respects, working on understanding and raising awareness of racism and how it manifests, and to try and explore ways to address that, is kind of what does bring me. Things always circle back to that. And kind of parallel to that, I have the colleagues that I work with. I have colleagues at St Mary's University in Twickenham who are colleagues of colour, and white colleagues who would call allies. And collectively we're constantly looking at how to make our university a more inclusive space, and to be for us all to feel like we can be our authentic selves and support others to raise awareness about, there's so many things that we've done. We all volunteer our time, but they are kind of, I consider them family, because they're also people I will go to if I'm having whatever sort of problems. But collectively, we kind of carry each other, we laugh together, we celebrate what we have in common and what our differences are. So I find, I guess what I've done is found a community. So I find pleasure in working with or being part of, finding my people, and then working with them towards a shared vision of a future that is better than where we are at the minute.
Okay, so basically you're saying like people.
I should probably have said knitting or sewing or something, shouldn't I? I like baking,
But yeah, so basically the people that you surround yourself with are people with similar lived experiences, I'd say, or something that brings you connection, right? So technically, people who try to take your joy away, you're actually advocating or flipping things to take back that joy. Does that sound about right? Or
I don't know, I have to think about and process that comment.
Well, I guess we don't want other people to navigate, to control how we move, do we? But outside of that though, I guess you said knitting. That's funny. But like any type of music that you like, or books that you read? Do you read any books?
Well, at the minute it's very PhD related. So any reading is around colonialism, how it's manifests in the landscape, in the heritage, etc. So I'm interested in reading also Black British history, South Asian history, as in South Asian British history. These are really interesting to me, and at the moment it's where my head's at. And yeah, music. I like a diverse range. My kids probably find me quite embarrassing.
Why?
Yeah, well, because I love Stormzy and but I like Punjabi music as well. I listen to all Bollywood songs that I grew up listening to. And
who's your favorite Punjabi artist?
Punjabi. So I'm not very good with names, and I'm not going to sing you excerpts of because I'm better sort of remembering sort of the music that But yeah, I can't name anybody, I'm afraid.
Okay, but maybe I can start listening because I never listened to it really before. So maybe you can give our audience maybe one person. Do you know anybody? One person, one artist that you can think of,
Let's circle back to
or a
that
Bollywood,
later.
or a Bollywood movie. Yeah.
Bollywood movie. Again, it's the old films. There's a film called Kabhi Kabhi,
Could be. Okay.
which I think it's not so much the film; it's more just the memories associated with it. There was when the South Asian community was growing in the West End of Newcastle. There was a local Punjabi guy who bought an old cinema, and he kind of would put on Bollywood films there on a weekend, and so the whole community, Sikh, Muslim, Hindu, we'd all go and watch these films, and it was remembering how it was a very white place, Newcastle, and it's still nationally compared to national statistics, it's still majority white, but very much so then. So you suddenly enter these spaces where everyone looked like you, and you just felt safe, and it was lovely. And our parents looked more relaxed, and mum would have got dressed up and put lipstick on and things. So so it's those films and film like Kabhi Kabhi and Bollywood films, everything's so much larger than life. The colours are like bang, and the music and the fight scenes are like dishum, 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 and people punching each other. And I used to literally, my mum would have to try and drag me back down onto the chair because I'd be standing on the chair, jumping up and down, saying, "Oh, kill him, he's behind you." It's like some bizarre pantomime. So
that's definitely something I'm gonna have to do this weekend or this week is to watch a Bollywood movie because I've never done it before. So thank you for that. Okay, wow. Okay, so I guess we talked about. I guess you mentioned some of your research interests. It seems history is very prominent for you. But what about, could you think of any people who have been, I'd say, influential at different stages of your life?
Just generally?
Just generally.
My mum is someone who she shaped the feminists in myself, and I don't know, my sister would probably maybe would feel the same as well. Not intentionally, she's like, I would sort of say an accidental feminist, but she is someone who wanted her girls to be independent and strong, and we would be under physical attack, like our house, or and she had a whole array of domestic items that had been turned into weapons to defend us, and she was fierce. She was fierce and fierce. She's 4'11", this tiny Punjabi woman, but she was fierce. So watching her strength and made me feel like, you know, there's a fight, and we can't just hide away from it, and so she's inspirational in that way. And then I don't know, there's been colleagues along the way, friends along the way who have... There was a friend who just passed away now, Jill. She was a neighbour who, down when I used to live in East London, and she gave me a strong sense of the local community and how a group of strangers really, just because we all live in close proximity, can create a community and kind of be there for each other, really. And that's something that I really have valued and realised that can be in a neighbourhood, or it can be in a workspace, or in other spaces, or we can so I'm always looking to create community networks that we can then collaborate on and do things, whatever that thing might be. So South Asian Heritage Month at Durham, formulating networks and relationships to make so that is marked every year. And so there's my sister is incredible. She's like a powerhouse, and
Is this older,
younger,
younger? Right? Okay.
2.5 years younger, Seema. So and she's an anti-racist, but she seems like she's fearless. She's very, very much like my mum. So together, or growing up, there were things that would happen, and the two of us would just hold each other and carry each other. So so that relationship was important, but also that inspiration of, we're all like grafters, we work hard, and we kind of not very good at just relaxing. We have to be busy and doing things, always doing things. Yeah,
That's good. So, but it sounds like collaborative practices has just been something that you've been constantly doing throughout your life, right? That's really nice. That's really nice. Okay, well, when it comes to like influential, hopefully your family listens to this, because then they'll get some good points from them. But what about some challenging moments for you as a scholar and maybe as a mother? How did you navigate them?
I mean, as a scholar, it's that word sort of feels odd. It doesn't seem to sit with how I see myself, but I don't know whether that's just because I started my kind of work career as a school teacher. I used to be a history teacher. Kind of a part of you still always feels like you're a teacher. But I enjoy engaging with scholarship and reading all the time.
But what would you consider yourself then? Like, how would you identify yourself as
I don't know.
You know, there's like terms like scholar, activist, or educator. Okay, educator. Okay, that's good.
Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah. So I think it can be challenging that if you're. I mean, I'm a senior lecturer, so arguably, I should feel quite comfortable in university spaces, but I still feel there's often things I don't understand. There's systems I don't understand, or just ways of being that kind of feel I can find that challenging to you know, it's not as straightforward as you study and then you get a qualification. There's all the other stuff, isn't it, around it, conferences and presenting and sort of realizing increasingly this matters. And so, but then again, there's been people along the way who have helped, and I try and help others as well, who, again, it's community creating. So, you know, you've been so helpful, haven't you, with, I come to you and say, I'm doing this ethics form, what can you help? And you're like, bang, straight back, right, there you go. And and we've got our little group of resilient thrivers, haven't we? And so through that little network, we all answer each other's questions or offer support or take a look at a piece of work. And so it is challenging, but there's support there. People are generous with their time, and kind of gives you a feeling of a sense of the beauty and the hope that we have.
Right. So it's back to that collaborative ethos that kind of gives you that. All right. Energy to go. Okay. Well, thank you for sharing that, your background with us. This is this time where let's flip it. Okay. So these are our flipping questions. So we will get more into your work and how you flip the script to the traditional narratives within it. I've had a chance to do an overview of some of your research interests you shared with me. Much of it was around, I would say, Britishness and whiteness in schools. So for our Viber audience and us too, let's flip the Britishness script in schools, shall we? Now, our first question would be, what are your perceptions of traditional or normative narratives in the work that you do?
I think it can be frustrating. It feels like Groundhog Day because there's been work, there's so much research, scholarship, awareness, activism around moving away from a Eurocentric curriculum, which is what we still sort of heavily teach. And then things happen. I think obviously Stephen Lawrence's murder was a trigger. There seemed to be an appetite to address all manner of racism, but amongst that, a Eurocentric curriculum, which is problematic and from a sort of racism perspective, isn't it? Because you're kind of telling history in a way that elevates certain groups of people and their endeavours and marginalises and erases other people. But then it subsides, or you have people who agitate against that kind of work and position you as some sort of an extremist or a threat because when you're sort of trying to move towards racial justice. And then we've had, obviously, with the Black Lives Matter movement, 2020 and George Floyd's murder, seemed to have been an appetite for change again. And teachers are working, there are many teachers working to address that, but we've got a long way to go. And in terms of policy and government, there was I think it was in 2022 that a white paper again sort of said that schools need to be careful not to politicise history. They need to have a more balanced approach. If you're going to teach empire, you've got to teach the good bits as well. I think there's real problematic, basically anything but critical engagement with our past. So I think, we've got those challenges ahead. But I should say, I should have mentioned, there's a collective of teachers and academics in the Northeast working on which I'm part of. I'm a trustee for Project North Star, and Project North Star's developing a website that we're launching in June. You're invited, 15th of June, the Hope Exchange in Sunderland.
Oh, nice.
And this is a website where we look at Black British history through a Northeast lens, because it's so that's an example again of that's a teacher-led. Terry Graham's head of history. It's a teacher-led initiative where trying to address the absences or reframing history. So it's not about taking things out, but just sort of saying, how do we complicate the picture so that it's to better understand our past, but why Britain looks the way it does today, Britain's place in the world, etc.
What I would ask is also, since you've been teaching for a little bit and you've been around, you mentioned that there's a certain appetite when something happens, right? So for instance, you have Stephen, you have Lawrence, and you have the BLM. What are differences then compared to now? Do you feel like the appetite now is a bit more authentic? Is it not authentic? Is things actually progressing faster now than it was back then, or is it similar? Does that make sense? What I'm asking?
Yes, it does. That's a good question. I think in terms of the political climate, there's still kickback against this sort of work, which is a worry because schools are under surveillance. They expect to hold the front line of whatever Britishness is through fundamental British values. You have them, you walk into a school, they're there, they are listed, fundamental British values, etc. But I wonder whether we're in a moment now where there's more of an acknowledgement of the importance of centering Black voices or perspectives. So if you think of like the supplementary school movement back in the sort of 60s and 70s, that was maybe more on the margins, their existence, whereas now it feels like for instance, the Black curriculum, there's that moving into the mainstream. I have a fantastic colleague, Lisa Panford, who I work with at St Mary's University. She's doing amazing work in terms of decolonising the modern foreign languages or languages curriculum. So there's things seem to feel like they're more towards the centre. But I don't think that at any point, it doesn't feel like you can relax
Okay.
It's still like you're still pushing. You need to keep pushing. That if you relax, I still wonder. I don't know if this. I still wonder whether, if you're not impacted by issues around race and racism, whether you still would get it. Whether you have reason to care, and then because and therefore to join efforts to either decolonize the curriculum or at least critically engage with our past. So I'm conscious that you can't really bring lasting change if it's not through a collaboration. We need it has to be a collective endeavor.
Right.
So if it's always sort of the people who are impacted doing the pushing,
Right.
we don't have the power. You know,
Right.
this is on a systemic level. This is only so far you can go. So I'm cautiously optimistic at the moment.
Cautiously. It's interesting because I was thinking about like a metaphor. Like you talk about this appetite, and it's like people have appetite when something when something happens, right? So for instance, BLM and George Floyd, people begin to have an appetite for race equity, etc. Then we are the type of people who provide them the ingredients to what they need to do. But then people don't, and it's interesting because I mean, people love our food, right?
Yeah.
Here in England,
Yeah.
Indian food is like the number one takeaway food in England, right? So it's just funny because we have these tools and these answers, right? These ingredients for people to kind of divulge and understand how to like create something that allows us to work collaboratively together and let everyone feel included.
Yeah.
But then there's people obviously countering that, right? And not wanting to have a taste of what we have cooking, right? And I think that's something that that you just mentioned. I think that's important to highlight. And you mentioned about how there's like these British values that are like posted, right, in your schools, and how these values are, I guess, embedded. And I feel like when we're talking about this, about how this appetite for race equity or equity in general, there's people who do fight for it, but the main people who do are the ones who are targets of it. But then when we think about British values, what are they? And that was one of the main things I was thinking about with the research you sent me, right? Some of the research you sent me was around the curriculum, Britishness, this imperial nostalgia within the curriculum and with English people, right? Specifically, what would you consider British values since you've been living here? What would be your common British values, and how do you flip that?
I don't know if there's such a thing really as. I think it's just it's made up. It's
okay.
I think it feels like something that's. So these values like democracy or individual liberty, respect for people who are different to yourself. These are great to have, but they're not exclusive to Britain. So it kind of feels like it's a division that's just been fabricated to make kind of an us and them thing.
Okay.
And you're having to be careful not to be the them, which you already are because you look different to the white normative. But so, and then when we see politicians at the highest levels saying things that are openly Islamophobic, for instance, and incite, there's a direct correlation with these comments that are made that are anti-Muslim. There are spikes in attacks on Muslim people at those times, and you think, gosh, that's directly in opposition to the British value of respecting difference, or so I don't trust the idea of it. I don't buy into it.
Okay.
I don't know what British values.
There's a bit of ambiguity within it, right?
Yeah, it feels like something that's been used to police, particularly the Muslim community. After, well, it's not just that I feel it's like in scholarship. It's much sort of talked about. That
Okay.
it's part of a surveillance to.
That's a good way to put it. Okay, thank you for that. And so within that, so could you just like share a particular moment that you consider a turning point in your like your research and in your life when it comes to the work that you do? Because obviously, like when we just talked about what British values are. When you're in schools, that's a huge way of understanding what each generation is being taught, right? In schools, with the curriculum, how each generation is going to navigate their life through what's in the curriculum, if that makes sense. So what would you consider like a turning point in your life when you actually realized, I need to really do this work, if you get me, the work that you do?
Yeah. In terms of the work, because fundamental British values, this sort of was only introduced post 9/11. But when I was teaching, and when I first started teaching in the mid-90s, I became a history teacher because I loved history. And the environment I was in made me realise that I didn't have that luxury as a brown woman to go into a classroom and teach. What they're seeing as a white woman, as a brown person, so that being constantly racialized and being on the receiving end of racism, I just thought, okay, I got out of the West End of Newcastle. I literally escaped out of the West End of Newcastle, thinking, going to education is my route out. I continued to encounter racism in university spaces. Now as a teacher, it continues. Actually, I can't get away from this thing, so I might as well turn around and face it and say, okay, this is going to be the thing that I need to be. So I suppose it was that first teaching post. I mean, just to give an example, I was teaching in a school, white majority, where there was a supply teacher brought in. He was an elderly South Asian man, and the class that he was teaching, they were known to be a really problematic group of kids. But they jumped on the desks and made monkey noises and all of this. And so this gentleman spoke to the head teacher, and it was just brushed under the carpet, and we couldn't believe there was no repercussion to it. So I'm a lecturer in teacher education now. So I've just found myself, I am still, but I first left teaching to move into Holocaust education, because that provided an avenue through which to explore where racism can lead. That the pedagogy involved in Holocaust education has opened up ways of thinking for me that have helped me sort of reframe my understanding of how people of colour are perceived and deficit views, etc. And then through the PhD, engaging with works of people like Bell Hooks, Nicola Roller, their writings really resonate again, and so that it's sharpened my focus onto anti-racism against black and brown people. So, yeah.
Well, you just mentioned about your work. Could you speak a bit more about your PhD research, like when it comes to the decolonizing the curriculum and whiteness in particular?
So I guess the research is decolonial in intent, but initially what I want to understand is, if you are seeking to do this kind of decolonial work, which requires critical engagement with Britain's imperial past and how its legacies in the present, then that's going to be challenging if you as a white person have been raised to celebrate the imperial past and to see the empire as sort of this benevolent thing that came to the world. The Empire Day was celebrated in this country till I think 1957, 1958. If you were at school, you got half a day off to celebrate. So you've certainly got generations at the moment who were actively taught about sort of the glories of empire. And we have in the primary curriculum opportunities to teach through local history about local heroes. Explorers is one of the themes. So I live in an area where one of these explorers, Captain Cook,
Captain
Cook,
Cook,
he wasn't a captain at the time.
Not Captain James Hook, but Captain Cook.
Yeah,
Cook.
James Cook,
Okay.
who's from Middlesbrough. He was born in the village of Martin. He's viewed locally as the working class hero. He's in this features in the landscape in all sorts of ways, places, and it feels to me, I'm not from Teesside, I'm from Newcastle, so I'm a bit of an outsider coming in it, having travelled Australia and sort of engaged with that history from a different perspective. I was just curious that I couldn't see sort of any critical engagement with the memory or acknowledgement of how people who were colonised in that era, and especially sort of in relation to Cook and his actions, view him very differently, and that's not featured. And so, but then where the memory is so tied in with the area, an area that's actually seen as working class, it's economically sort of deprived. If you've got a positive narrative that's hooked onto someone who happened to be a colonial figure, would you want to critically engage? It's a source of pride. And so then, if you're teaching, are you able to are you able to critically engage with these kind of local histories and narratives that link into national and global ones? So I'm curious about that, and a kind of the curiosity in part stemmed from various kind of surveys that tell us that teachers, whilst there is a wider even post 2020 an appetite to some say diversify, some say decolonize. I don't know if there's a shared understanding of the terms, but in white majority areas, teachers have reported being reticent to do so. That it's afraid of local response, but we don't quite know what that means.
Okay.
So that's what I'd like to understand using this case study. Is it that do teachers worry about a backlash, that things will, we are in the culture wars, the history wars, or are teachers part of this? We know that within the profession, it's a majority white profession. Do they even sort of see the systemic nature of barriers, or maybe there's decolonising work going on, and that I'm going to find out that there is critical engagement in schools despite the local perceptions that are maybe more one-sided.
Yeah, and that's I was going to ask you about, so like, because you've been a teacher in the South, right, and in the North.
Newcastle.
Are there any differences within the teacher workforce there? Do you feel like, or
it's more the places in London that I taught, which was Waltham Forest type area, the teaching workforce was more diverse, although a few of the teachers were from overseas, so the diversity wasn't sort of from British black or brown people. The area that I started teaching in sort of deeper into Essex back in the 90s, I think that's become more diverse. I don't know what that's like now. But then where I work, the university that I work, which is based in Twickenham, the teachers on the teacher training programs are still, I'd say, majority white. So I think even within London, there's, Richmond, Twickenham, these are very white spaces. So the profession kind of often reflects the local population. But
And how does that make you feel? How do you try to teach around instances where you have people like Captain James Cook, and there's obviously a colonial history with that, but then you said like the local community have a tied understanding of that person being a hero, right? And there's obviously like remember BLM, there was statues being torn down, etc. How do we teach the next generation about these types of people? Do you have any like suggestions, or do you know anything that's happening around that?
So again, down in Twickenham, my colleague Sarah Batty who runs the PGC history program. She has been bringing in a variety of people to teach, to deliver sessions to the PGC students. And so mine is a session at what does an anti-racist history curriculum look like? And so what I advocate for, where I think the opportunities are, is local history that is part of this country's sort of 400-500 year history. It is actually everywhere. It might be in the plants that we have in the garden, or the grander buildings, place names, street names. It may be James Cook, when he was a little boy, he walked down with his father. His father was a farmer, down into the farmers, into a fair, into a market on what is now my local high street. So the history is all around us. Corinne Fowler is a scholar who's written quite a lot about stately homes and how so the history is all around us. And so I would say engage with those local histories because it provides an opportunity from that local to look at the global, the bigger narratives. Engage with, bring in the voices of people who might be typically marginalised or even erased. So that might be indigenous populations of the countries that were colonised, to draw in their perspectives. It may be that within this country, if we're looking at the civil rights movement, for instance, it's always, typically it's the US civil rights movement that is discussed rather than the civil rights movement that we had in this country running at the same time. I've learned
that, but why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think because it's uncomfortable. It's easier to sort of say those people over there, they had the slave trade and then we abolished it.
It's like Renee DeLau, she talks about and why I no longer talk to white people about race. She mentions Britain saw the money and not the blood, right? I think
it all happened over there. It didn't happen here. So it's easier to maybe ignore. Okay. Sally Tomlinson talks in that article I shared with you, describes it as a monstrous ignorance, doesn't she? That there's just this complete lack of awareness of what empire was, really. And I think we have to find ways of teaching this history to help young people make sense of the world that we live in, to understand A, that racial injustice exists, and B, that how that we need to collectively move forward. These aren't just people, black and brown people, agitating right. Because they just, I don't know why they think we would just spend so much of our time doing that for no reason. I think back to my parents and how important they were in providing me with I think it's Nicola Rollick calls it the perspective advantage that people of colour can have, that at school we either didn't exist when history was taught, or we were mentioned, I don't remember seeing myself at all in the curriculum, but you had the Black Peoples of America unit. So it's that deficit view of these sort of people who were enslaved, and then, yeah. So
It's definitely through a deficit lens.
yeah,
A lot of our history was taught, especially when I was growing up too. Yes, right.
yeah. So but when I would come home and my parents would talk about, they were born in colonial India, and they had, for them, it was an immense source of pride, the gaining independence and the role that their family, my mum's family, played in making that come about. And we're Punjabis, so there's a very specific history there for. So my parents gave us an alternative narrative, so that I, from a very young age, understood when I was in school that this isn't. I'm being taught a history that is skewed. So there's, I think, probably potential in communities to engage with, for teachers to talk to the children in their classroom, because they will potentially come with a different perspective that a white teacher might not have had the privilege of encountering.
Do you feel like you still you have to fill your mother's shoes with your own family?
Oh, I do. So with the children, my mum made sure that her kids were fluent in Urdu and Punjabi, and that we learn Arabic. So I've managed none of that with my kids. So in that respect, I've completely failed, and that's it's terrible. It really is. Like, I do regret that. But in terms of being race cognizant, race aware, being conscious of colonial histories and how they shape the world in the present,
right.
Has been something that has felt really important. My girls, at times, I say at times, like if it's warmer weather, their skin darkens, but can be white passing. When in the winter months, the skin can be lighter, or certainly not. You can't quite figure out what their racial identity is just by looking at them. But I kind of feel at the moment is likely that they are going to need to be race aware, either so they're not reproducing racism themselves in their actions, or when they're on the receiving end, to feel empowered enough to name it and call it out. And the younger one, she's quite sensitive to language, so she's often described by people can't seem to get her name right, so they anglicize it constantly, which irritates her.
What? Oh no, what's the name? But I was okay.
It has the name Sarah, okay. And so which is Arabic, for Sarah. So she's then called Sarah. She's like, no, it's Sarah, and then Sarah, and then she gives up. Or someone will say her name. I'm saying someone who's often teachers, but they'll say, "Oh, such an exotic name." So she's like, exotic. She makes that link.
That really quickly.
Yeah, from a young age.
That's really good, though.
Yeah.
Okay.
And some of it also, this awareness, even when she was little, she was in a history class where they learnt about the slave trade. I think it was about the slave trade, and she was 6 or 7 years old, and she came home and asked, if I lived in olden times, what colour would I be? And I said, you'd be the colour you are now, because Daddy's white, Mummy's brown, so you'd be, a mix of us both. No, in olden times, what colour would I be? And so we went round in circles. She got upset, and I realised she wanted me to say white, because that, which is your proximity to safeness and your proximity to blackness, means that bad things will happen to you. And she's got this sort of sense of, she's always on alert for risk assessment in any situation, and being black is a risk. And I thought, wow, she's 6, 7 years old, and she's associating blackness with bad things happening to you. At that point, I wasn't thinking of a PhD, but it did, because my background, secondary history teaching. But then I became a governor at her local school and learnt more that way about the primary curriculum. And so with the research, I'm focusing on primary partly because I know that's where Cook is taught in our area. But actually, primary, from a young age, you've got black and brown children and white children learning this is it, what it means to be black, this is what it means to be brown, and it's sowing problems for the future in terms of how you see yourself, like Frantz Fanon's sort of work on,
Yes.
that hating yourself, and so I also feel like there's an epistemic injustice in when I see narratives of Cook in my area that either exoticize or ignore the existence of the indigenous populations. And I think a lot of the push for change, for challenges to these deficit narratives have come from black and brown communities in this country. But where you've got this Australian, New Zealand, these regions, don't think you have those, Pacific Islanders, we don't have those communities in the same way to push. So it feels like because we don't have kids in the classroom who have that heritage, I find it upsetting to think that it's being overlooked, the fact that actually this is problematic, how people are being viewed and depicted. And so I think, again, the colonial histories, the narratives rooted in that era, we want to expose them and challenge them. Because it is often said to me that, oh, well, with Cook, it was a long time ago, he was, or people like him were like of their time. So, well, yeah, but it's not neatly parceled back in there, and then it's having an impact in the now in ways sometimes can't imagine.
Right, product of their time. But that argument in itself is interesting, because there's also people during that time who didn't have those types of values, right? Who opposed that, right? So yeah. I think that's also something that's lost within that argument as well. Yeah, thank you for sharing. So it sounds like you're flipping the script in a way where you want people to have an understanding of local history, but through an anti-racist lens, is what it sounds like, right? And that's amazing. I'm excited to, like, when you're done with your PhD, I'm excited. I'm gonna be excited to read it. I mean, PhDs are long, but I'll try to go through it, overview it, But yeah, thank you for sharing that. Now we're gonna get to like the end of the segment, right? And yeah, all right, just hold on real quick. Good. All right, I can cut it out. All right, so like I said, we're now at the concluding part of our show, where Shabana will offer us insight around rehumanization. So if you could reflect on your journey thus far, what do you know now that you wish you knew before when it comes to the work that you do?
I think the importance of finding your people, people who share a vision that you have for a future that you're hopeful for, that realization that that's not just going to happen. The status quo is comfortable. So I think for a while I think I just on my own tried to do what I could, but I didn't really feel, it was frustrating. And it's the power of the connections with like-minded people, be they black or brown, be they white allies, has given me courage to do more and more and more. I think life might have been a bit easier if I'd come to that sooner.
Okay.
And I also feel like while my dad was alive, I wish I'd had more of a realization then of nationally the South Asian resistance movements that I've only come to sort of be aware of in recent years. I was aware of things like the Brixton uprisings, but where you've got resistance coming from South Asian communities to racism, the way it was reported in the press, I kind of just didn't realise actually what's happening is an uprising. And because in Newcastle, resistance didn't look like that. Resistance was more someone like my mum who had to literally fight off people. If I'd known it wasn't just us, that this is happening up and down the country, and that we are not the problem, that this is a systemic issue, this is a broader issue, I think it might have given me courage sooner.
Okay.
So I always say to my students who might be struggling when they're in the white spaces, my black and brown students, just find your people. And they might be in your school, or they might be, in the broader community.
Okay.
You'll sustain each other, and to give as well as receive is really important. And these are values actually that we were raised with, and that I didn't carry out into the world initially. Just saw it as something that was specific. My mum and dad always went on and on about community, value community, and I used to think, oh, that's just like
I like how your accent just came out there.
I know, they'd say, like, I think, that's just like those boring Asian aunties, and it's taken me a while to see their community building efforts, why they were important.
But it goes back to what you said about like the system. A system teaches us to be this individualism type. And we come from collective communities, and it sounds like what you're saying is like, obviously this is our collective praxis, our collaborative praxis series, and it sounds like you had the praxis, but on its own, you need collaborativeness with that, right? So that collective action comes with praxis, right? I think that's very important. Thank you. That's that's very powerful. Mentioning how how you reflected on that. So I just wanted to kind of give you this opportunity to kind of share with our listeners as well. What does rehumanization look like to you?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'm not sure. I'm trying to think firstly what dehumanization looks like, to then think about rehumanizing.
Okay.
I think to not see people as singular things, or not reducing people to this or that, but I love stories, so I think listening to people's stories and finding, at the end of the day, we all, we're humans trying to navigate life, and there will be commonalities, there will be differences, but just to have that respect that everyone's got something to bring to the table, to have humility, but yeah, I can't articulate
that's
it.
okay.
I can't articulate it.
I think that was great. I think what you're saying. So basically, so just to be open to difference.
Yeah,
right?
To be open to difference, to listen to people's stories about themselves, and to think and reflect on that, and what connects you to people.
And to be curious, right?
To be curious, yeah.
Okay. That's all right. That's cool though. Okay. No, I appreciate you coming here today. It's been we can go on and on. We can go on and on.
I really enjoy talking
but obviously
to
because
you.
of the time frame. But yeah, I enjoy this too. I enjoy listening to you. You're amazing. Keep doing what you're doing. Do you have any like social media handles or platforms that people could follow you on?
Twitter at Shabana Marshall. It's just my name.
At Shabana Marshall, your name. Are you on anything else?
No.
LinkedIn, nothing? Okay, so Twitter, y'all. Twitter. You want to find Shabana, go on Twitter. Okay. Well, thank you so much,
oh, you're welcome.
Shabana, for this. It's been amazing. We talked about just ingredients, right? If people have appetite, the ingredients are here with the vibers and how we collaborate. But yeah, people of color, I use the term resilient minority. So REM folks in particular, we have the ingredients for flipping the script, right? And rehumanization. But thank you for today. And yeah, that's everything. All right.
Thank you.